Six men walked into the hotel restaurant and asked for a table for six, and the young waitress who greeted them wrote down seven place settings instead. And when the oldest man at the table asked her why, she did not apologize. She simply told him the name of a canyon he had never said out loud to anyone outside his unit. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you have ever carried a piece of someone else's story so carefully that you forgot it was allowed to be shared, this one is for you. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because what happened at that table did not start that night. It started 3 years earlier on a hillside neither of them have ever been able to fully leave behind. The Ashgrove Hotel sat at the edge of a small town most people only pass through on the way to somewhere bigger, and its restaurant, the Lantern Room, ran on a rhythm so steady the staff could set their watches by which regulars ordered what and when. Mara Doyle had worked the evening shift there for 2 years, ever since she'd taken the job with a single condition in her own mind, that nobody ask about the years before. She was 28, quiet in the way that made people assume she was shy rather than simply economical with her attention, and she moved through a dining room the way someone moves through a room they've already memorized in the dark. She never bumped a chair, she never dropped a tray. She always knew, without looking directly at anyone, which table had gone quiet in a way that meant trouble. Nobody at the Ashgrove knew that Mara had spent 6 years as a combat medic attached to a joint operations team, the kind of assignment that left behind a service record with more redactions than sentences. She didn't talk about it, not because she'd been ordered not to, but because she had built her life after the uniform around the idea that some rooms didn't need to know what she used to carry. The scar along her collarbone stayed under her collar. When a glass shattered in the kitchen and half the waitstaff jumped, Mara simply kept walking because the sound wasn't the kind that had ever mattered to her. That Thursday had been ordinary until 7:40, when the host walked six men toward the private dining alcove near the back windows, the one usually reserved for anniversaries and small business dinners. Mara noticed them the way she noticed most groups of men who moved together with that particular economy of motion, the kind where nobody bumps into anybody else even when nobody's looking where they're going. She'd waited on veterans before. The Ashgrove sat close enough to a regional base that groups like this weren't unusual. Men gathering for a meal that had nothing to do with the menu and everything to do with a date none of them needed to check. She approached the table with her pad already out. The man closest to the aisle, broad through the shoulders with silver starting at his temples, looked up first. "Table for six," he said, and something in the careful flatness of his voice told her this wasn't the first time he'd said it that day. Mara nodded and began writing, and it was only after she'd started setting the table herself, since the private alcove wasn't on the main floor rotation that night, that she found herself reaching for a seventh set of silverware without entirely deciding to. She didn't think about it as she did it. That was the strange part, the part she'd turn over later. Her hands simply knew what the table needed before her mind caught up to why. She laid out six settings, and then, without breaking stride, a seventh at the head of the table nearest the window, facing the door the way a chair faces a door when the person who used to sit there liked to see who was coming in. The silver-haired man was the first to notice. He'd been mid-sentence with the man beside him, something about traffic on the interstate, and he stopped talking the moment his eyes landed on the extra plate. The whole table followed his gaze the way a room follows the one person who stopped speaking mid-word. Mara felt six pairs of eyes settle on her at once, and she kept her hands steady, because steady hands were the one thing she'd never had to fake. "Why seven?" the silver-haired man asked. His name, she would learn shortly, was Owen Castellan, and he asked the question the way a man asks something he already suspects the answer will hurt to hear. Mara looked at the table, at the six men who had gone very still, and at the empty seventh chair angled just slightly toward the window. She could have said it was a mistake. She could have said the host gave her the wrong count, could have scooped up the extra plate and apologized and let the evening continue the way evenings at the Lantern Room usually did, quietly, forgettably, the way she preferred every evening to go. Instead, she found herself looking at the youngest man at the table, who had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the restaurant's lighting, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from having stood in rooms like this before, that these men had not come here for dinner. They had come here for a ritual, one they hadn't told the hostess about, one that lived entirely in the space between them. If you've ever watched a room go quiet around a grief nobody had named yet, drop the words "I see it" in the comments, because what came next in that alcove was not something any of these men expected to happen in a hotel restaurant on an unremarkable Thursday. Mara set the pitcher of water down slowly. "I didn't get the count wrong," she said. Owen's jaw tightened. "Then why?" "Because someone's missing from 6," she said, "and I don't think you'd have wanted me to make it look like nobody noticed." The youngest man, who would later introduce himself as Priest Callahan, though everyone at the table called him Priest for reasons nobody explained that night, pushed back from the table hard enough that the legs scraped against the hardwood. "How would you know that?" he said, his voice cracking on the last word. Owen raised a hand, the same quiet gesture of a man used to keeping younger men calm in rooms that were about to get complicated, but his eyes never left Mara's face. She could have backed away right there. She had spent 2 years perfecting the art of backing away from exactly this kind of moment, softening a mistake into an apology and disappearing back toward the kitchen before anyone asked a second question. But something about the seventh chair, angled toward the door the way it was, the way she'd said it without thinking, told her this wasn't a mistake she was allowed to walk back from. Not tonight. Not for these 6 men. "I'm going to ask you something," Owen said slowly, "and I need you to understand I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need to know how a waitress in a hotel restaurant 300 miles from the nearest base knew to set an extra place at our table." Mara looked at the window seat, empty, angled, waiting, the way it had been waiting in her own memory for longer than she wanted to admit. "Because I know what a canyon feels like when it takes someone with it," she said quietly. "And I know what the seventh person at a table like this usually means." The word canyon moved through the 6 men like a current. Priest's hand found the edge of the table and gripped it. One of the older men, heavyset with a weathered face, set down his water glass with a care that looked almost ceremonial. Owen's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted, the look of a man recalculating an entire evening in real time. "Say that again," he said. "I said I know what it means when 6 people sit down and set a table for 7, Mara answered. "I've done it myself." The table had gone fully silent now, silent enough that a server 2 tables over glanced toward the alcove, silent enough that even the low hum of the dining room seemed to fall back a few decibels. Priest was staring at her the way a man stares at something he can't decide is a coincidence or a miracle. Owen leaned forward, both forearms on the table, his voice dropping low enough that only the 7 of them, 6 men and one waitress who wasn't supposed to know any of this, could hear it. "Whose table did you set?" he asked. Mara felt the old, familiar tightening behind her sternum, the one she'd trained herself not to show on her face no matter what was happening underneath it. She thought about the easy answer, the one that would let her retreat to the kitchen with her dignity and her privacy intact. She thought about 2 years of quiet Thursdays where nobody at the Ash Grove had ever asked her a question she couldn't deflect with a shrug and a change of subject. Then she thought about the empty chair by the window and the way these 6 men had walked in together without needing to discuss where anyone would sit, the way grief organizes a room without a single word being spoken, and she understood that whatever privacy she was protecting mattered less tonight than whatever these men had been carrying alone. "Mine," she said. 3 years ago, 6 of us went up into a canyon we weren't supposed to be anywhere near that late in the season, and only 5 of us came back down. If you've ever had to say something out loud for the first time in years because staying silent would have cost someone else more than it cost you, comment the words "go on," because Owen Castellan was about to ask the question that had been sitting unanswered in 6 men's chests for 3 years, and Mara Doyle was the only person left alive who could give him the answer. "You were there," Owen said. "It wasn't a question anymore." "I was the medic," Mara said. "Attached to a different unit than yours, most likely, given how far apart our 2 operations must have been running that season. But the terrain doesn't care whose patch you're wearing. A canyon collapse doesn't check unit designations before it decides who it's going to take." Owen's hand had gone flat against the table, pressing down as though he needed something solid under his palm. Priest hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, his eyes fixed on Mara with an intensity that made the rest of the restaurant seem to recede entirely. The heavyset man, who Mara would later learn was named Desmond Ruiz, spoke for the first time, his voice rough. "Whose seat did you set for?" he asked. "At your table, 3 years ago. Who were you saving a place for?" Mara's hands found the back of the empty chair, the seventh chair, the one she'd set without deciding to. His name was Silas, she said. Silas Bellum. He carried point on every mission because he said he'd rather be the first one to find trouble than the last one to hear about it, and he used to complain that the coffee at every forward post tasted like it had been filtered through a boot, and none of us ever told him that was probably close to the truth. He didn't come down off that ridge with the rest of us. The name landed in the alcove the way a stone lands in still water, rippling outward through six faces at once. Priest made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Owen closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something in his posture had changed, had softened at the edges the way grief softens a person when it finally has somewhere to go. We didn't know his name, Owen said quietly. That's the thing nobody tells you about operations like ours. Different unit, different canyon, different season, but the reports get sealed the same way every time. We heard there'd been a medic attached to a search element who stayed behind an extra 6 hours looking for a sixth man after the official window closed. We heard the medic never gave up the search, even after command called it. We never had a name to put to that. We just had an empty chair we've been setting for 3 years, for a man none of us ever met, because we knew what it cost someone to keep looking that long after everyone else had stopped. Mara felt something crack open in her chest that she'd kept sealed for 3 years, the particular grief of being both the one who searched and the one who eventually had to walk away without finding what she was looking for. I searched until my radio told me to stop, and I kept going anyway, she said. I found him 11 hours later, past the ridgeline, past where anyone thought to look, and I got to be the one who brought him home instead of leaving that job to someone who never knew him the way the rest of you did. I set a place for him every year on the date because I promised myself I wouldn't be the only one who remembered exactly what that cost. Desmond Ruiz pushed back his chair and stood, and for a moment Mara thought he meant to walk away, the way people sometimes do when a truth arrives heavier than they expected it to be. Instead, he crossed to where she stood by the seventh chair and extended his hand, not for a handshake exactly, but simply to hold something steady in the space between them. We've been coming to a different restaurant every year since it happened, he said. 6 different towns, 6 different tables, always asking for 6 place settings because none of us could bring ourselves to ask a stranger to set a 7th chair for a man they'd never heard of. We didn't think anyone would understand why we needed the space there, even if we didn't fill it. I understand exactly why you needed it, Mara said. Priest finally spoke again, his voice steadier now, though his eyes were wet in the low restaurant light. Did he say anything? He asked, at the end. Did Silas say anything? Mara thought about the 11 hours, about the parts she could share and the parts that belonged to her alone, the way certain things a dying man says only ever belong to the person holding his hand when he says them. He asked me to tell his team he held the line as long as he could, she said. He didn't know your names either, but he knew there were people who'd wonder, and he wanted them to know he didn't let go of that ridge until he had to. The silence that followed wasn't empty the way silence in a restaurant usually is. It was full, weighted, the kind of silence that happens when 6 men who had spent 3 years carrying an unanswered question finally set it down. Owen stood slowly, and for a moment Mara thought he might simply nod and let the evening move on, the way evenings eventually do. But instead, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small folded card, worn soft at the corners, the way something gets worn when it's been carried in the same pocket for years. We each carry a card with a name on it, he said. Different name each year, whoever we're setting the table for that season, though we never actually had a name until now. Silas Bellum. He unfolded the card and set it on the table beside the 7th place setting, where the name sat blank, waiting, the way it had been waiting for 3 years for someone to fill it in. Would you write it? He asked. You're the only one of us who actually knew him. Mara took the pen Owen offered and wrote the name in careful, steady letters, the same steady hands that had set the table without her permission 20 minutes earlier. And when she set the pen down, something in her chest that had been clenched for 3 years loosened just slightly. Not gone, not healed, but no longer entirely alone. If you've ever needed someone else to say a name out loud before you could finally believe you were allowed to grieve it, type the words "he mattered" in the comments right now, because what happened next in that small hotel restaurant would change the way 6 men and 1 waitress spent every Thursday for years afterward. They asked her to sit, not as their server, Owen made that clear, gesturing to the seventh chair, though she gently redirected them toward an eighth setting instead, because some chairs, she said, are meant to stay empty on purpose, and she would rather sit beside it than take its place. The staff at the Ash Grove would later say that was the night Mara Doyle stopped being the quiet girl who worked evenings and started being someone the regulars specifically asked to be seated with, though none of them ever fully understood why six strangers from out of town treated their waitress like she was already one of their own. Over the next 2 hours, the conversation moved the way conversation moves among people who've just discovered they've been carrying the same weight from opposite ends without knowing it. Owen talked about the year he'd almost quit the service entirely, convinced he'd never make peace with not knowing what happened on that ridge. Desmond talked about the tradition they'd built almost by accident, one dinner becoming an unbroken chain of Thursdays, a quiet act of refusing to let a stranger's sacrifice go unmarked. Priest, who'd idolized Silas from a distance without ever meeting him, asked question after question, hungry for details about someone he'd mourned without ever getting to know. Mara told them what she could, not the classified parts, not the coordinates or unit designations. She still wasn't permitted to cross even now, but the human parts, the ones that mattered. She told them about the 11 hours, about a canyon that got colder as the light went, about a promise she'd made to a dying man that she intended to keep, whether anyone ever asked her to explain it or not. Near the end of the evening, as the restaurant emptied out around them and the staff began the quiet work of resetting tables for the morning, Owen asked her the question that had been sitting underneath everything else they'd discussed. "Why did you leave?" he asked. "The service, I mean. After everything, after finding him, after all of it, why walk away from work you were clearly built for?" Mara considered the question longer than she'd considered most things that night. "Because I promised myself that if I ever got him home, I'd spend the rest of my life making sure people like you had somewhere to sit down and remember him properly," she said. "I couldn't do that from inside the uniform. I needed to be somewhere ordinary, somewhere quiet, somewhere a table for seven wouldn't raise questions I couldn't answer. I didn't expect the table to find me instead." Owen nodded slowly, the way a man nods when an answer settles something in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. Then he did something that surprised even Desmond, who'd known him the longest of anyone at that table. He reached for the ninth chair at the neighboring table, empty since the restaurant had mostly cleared out, and pulled it over to sit beside Silas's place, angled the same direction, facing the same door. "For the medic who found him," he said, not quite meeting Mara's eyes. "So there's always a seat waiting for you too, whether you're the one serving the table or not." The other 5 men nodded, one by one, a quiet agreement passing around the table without needing to be spoken aloud. Mara felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 3 years. Not relief exactly, and not closure either, because closure had never been the right word for grief like this, but something closer to company, the particular hard-won comfort of no longer being the only one who remembered. If a story like this reminds you that the people who carry the heaviest things are often the quietest ones in the room, subscribe and stay with us, because there are more stories like Mara's waiting to be told, stories about the ones who kept a promise long after anyone was watching, and the tables that somehow always find their way to 7. They came back the following Thursday, and the one after that, and within a month the Lantern Room had a standing reservation the staff simply called the Ridge Table. 7 place settings every time regardless of how many men walked through the door that week, because the 7th chair belonged to Silas Bellum now, officially, in a way it never had when it was only an idea 6 men carried without a name to hang it on. Mara requested that section every Thursday from then on, and nobody at the Ash Grove ever asked her why. Sometimes new customers glanced toward the alcove and asked the hostess why one chair always sat empty even when the table looked full. The hostess would simply say the chair wasn't empty, not really, that it was reserved for someone who mattered enough to 6 men that they'd never stopped setting a place for him. Mara kept the folded card Owen had given her that first night, the one with Silas's name written in her own careful handwriting, tucked into the drawer beneath the hostess stand where she could see it every time she walked past. She never volunteered the rest of her own story either, the parts about the canyon and the 11 hours and the promise she'd made in the dark to a man whose voice had grown quieter with every passing minute. Some things didn't need to be explained to everyone. They only needed to be understood by the people who were finally ready to hear them. And every Thursday evening, when 6 men walked through the doors of the lantern room and the hostess led them toward the alcove by the window, without needing to ask which table, Mara set 7 places before anyone said a word, the way she'd done it that very first night, the way she intended to keep doing it for as long as there were people left who remembered a name that had almost stayed unspoken forever. Not because it was her job, because some promises are the kind you keep long after the uniform comes off, long after the last mission ends, long after you've convinced yourself you're only an ordinary person pouring water at an ordinary table. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and I'll see you at the next table.